The title of the book that we reviewed is The History of the Philippines by Kathleen M. Nadeau. According to Prager Year 2002, Kathleen M. Nadeau is an associate professor of anthropology at California State University, and she is the author of The Liberation Theology in the Philippines, Faith in Revolution. This is the only background of Kathleen M. Nadeau because we can find another background about her. The main idea of this book is about the Southeast Asian prehistory and the Philippines until to all of the presidents of the Philippines. This book is intended to provide students and interested lay people with up-to-date, concise, and analytical histories of many of the nations of the contemporary world.
Chapter 1: Southeast Asian Prehistory and the Philippines, the Ancient Philippine Slavery. Southeast Asia, of course, is a modern delineation, and the region was contiguous with China in prehistoric times. However, Southeast Asia as defined here refers to the geographical area that includes the modern nation states of Vietnam, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. At the end of the Ice Age, when the seas began to rise again, the Philippines became an archipelago surrounded by water. Southeast Asia is in the monsoon zone and has soggy soil that is well suited for rice farming. Slaves generally took a good deal of satisfaction in being attached to their masters. The various types of slaves range from the captured of ransom ends at one extreme to those who sold themselves into slavery to someone for whom they felt a debt or gratitude from the heart at the other extreme, while some slaves were sacrificed, for example, in times when a boat was launched or when a great seafarer has passed away. Most slaves ordinarily lives not much different from those who were free. Chapter 2: Spanish Colonization 1521 to 1896 Until Impact of Colonial Christianity. The Spanish colonization of the Philippines was a significant historical event in the 16th century. However, colonization was never so central a phenomenon as to outweigh in importance local historical developments that were already long in place. This chapter examines the historical processes that underpin the Spanish colonization of the Philippines. The Spanish, who transmitted the Christian faith, held in common otherworldly and future-oriented conceptions of the Bible, while the Filipinos interpreted the scriptures more in a present-oriented and experiential way. The Spanish colonization process attempted to reconstruct the core of Filipino ideology and social life. By such means, the Filipinos were led to obey their Spanish overlords. Chapter 3: The Philippine Revolution 1896 to 1902 to the Revolution against the United States 1899 to 1902. After establishing the capital in Manila, Spanish officials had interest in developing the countryside and largely confined their activities to the galleon trade coming out of the capital city, while the friars established themselves on agricultural lands. The Spanish first implemented a system of indirect rule by appointing local kings and princes as provincial governors or village heads. One scholar, Cristina Blanc Santon, discussed the changing status of women in relation to the Spanish colonization process. Female merchants swam out to meet the Spanish ships when they arrived. Manila was completely surrounded by the Filipinos when the Americans received the surrender of the Spanish troops, but the Filipinos were kept out of the city and prevented by the Americans from taking part in the surrender ceremonies. The Spanish authorities and Americans had made a closed-door deal that the Filipinos would not be allowed to help take the surrender of the Spanish troops. Chapter 4: American Colonization 1899 to 1946 to Liberation Islands. The Filipinos who had suffered long enough under the repressive Spanish have commissioned with the instruction to bear in mind that the government which they are establishing is designed not for our satisfaction nor for the expression of our theoretical views, but for the happiness, peace, and prosperity of the people of the Philippine Islands. And the measures adopted should be made to conform with their customs, their habits, and even their prejudice, to the fullest extent consistent with the accomplishment of the indispensable requisites of just and effective government. The Jones Law also provided a constitution and declared the intention of the United States to recognize Philippine independence as soon as a stable government could be established. Critics contended that the Governor-General office had been weakened first by reducing American presence in the civil service and in the executive department, and second by consulting with the Filipino leaders.
Chapter 5, Philippine Independence. By the end of the war, President Quezon had already died in exile in August 1944 and was succeeded by Vice President Osmeña, who assumed the office of the President of the Commonwealth Government. This was a difficult position because the President had to reconstitute the legislature when a large portion of those who had served in both houses had collaborated with the Japanese. President Osmeña, who became president after Quezon, had died in the United States in August 1944, returned with General Douglas MacArthur to the Philippines. That same year, President Osmeña won the presidential nomination of the Nacionalista Party, but Rojas refused to give way and formed a new liberal party wing. Chapter 6, the Marcos Regime, 1965 to 1986 until Marcos falls. Over the next 20 years, Marcos took apart this democracy and constructed an authoritarian government that lasted until he was ousted from office by a massive people power revolution in February 1986. Significantly, Marcos resorted to borrowing from outside and inside donors to pay for infrastructure projects. The biography of Marcos, like the sculpted heads of kings, looked down from temple steps at Angkor Wat. Marcos had his own bath cave into a hillside in central Luzon. Given the preponderantly religious population of the Philippines, it should come as no surprise that when Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law on September 21, 1972, which lasted until 1986, he met resistance. The Moro National Liberation Front, a separatist movement founded by Normis Wari in 1968, enlarged its revolutionary war against the Marcos regime. Of the 5 Philippines presidents whom Ninoy Aquino knew, only Marcos disliked him. When Marcos was first elected president, Ninoy Aquino was elected to the Senate. In January 1981, Marcos suddenly lifted martial law and ran for re-election unopposed. Despite the warnings of Imelda and others that if he returned, they could not guarantee safety, he thought he could convince Marcos to hold another election. Chapter 7, the Philippines after Marcos. Insurgency was rapidly growing in the Philippines as a direct consequence of the Marcos regime's corruption, chronic capitalism, and human rights violations. President Ramos increased the privatization and dismantling of existing state-owned monopolies, such as the domestic air carrier, shipping, telecommunication, and the oil industry. President Ramos' outward-looking plan was contentious and met with serious resistance from social activists, human rights advocates, and non-government organizers working to improve poor people's lives. Why we recommend this book? We would recommend this book to anyone who doesn't know anything about the history of the Philippines. because there are only 7 chapters amounting to about 100 pages. The book begins with the prehistoric times when the name Philippines didn't exist. They were just a bunch of islands through Spanish and American colonization up until Macapagal Arroyo's presidency.
There are mistakes that we notice in the book was in date years. There are quite a number of spelling errors and error. Example, Osmeña became Osmeña. Manuel was often Manual. 1978 and 1968 were sometimes confused. The author argues in the introduction that Manila was left by World War II more devastated than Warsaw. Later, the author contradicts herself by claiming that Manila was hit worse by World War II after Warsaw.